Uh, Welcome everyone for the second session of the third Islamabad Literature Festival. We are about to start our session officially. Before we start the session, we would request you to switch your cell phones on silent, or you can switch them off. That would be much better. And during the session, we would appreciate if you can observe complete silence. The format of the session is 1 hour long, 45 minutes for the discussion between our esteemed panelists, 15 minutes for question and answers. When the question and answer session starts, we would highly recommend if you can keep your questions short and precise and kindly refrain from making any outrageous statement. Thank you. As a the session, this is supposed to be the most intriguing session of the day for us. So I'll hand over the session to our moderator. Before that, I would like to let you know the title of the session. It's From Flaubert to Faiz, French and Pakistani Literatures. We had the esteemed speakers for today are Dr. Framji Minwalla, Mr. David Waterman, and Mr. Bilal Tanweer. The moderator of the session is Mr. Bilal Tanweer. He's a writer and a translator. He was one of Granta's New Voices and a recipient of the Pen Translation Fund Grant for his translation of Muhammad Khalid Akhtar's Chakiwara Me Visal. He also has translated 2 novels by Ibn Safi, The House of Fear, Random House, India, 2010. He's an honorary fellow of the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa. His debut novel, The Scatter Here, is 2 grade, won the 2014 Shakti Bhatt Prize, First Book Prize, and has been shortlisted for the DSC Prize for the South Asian Literature 2015. Over to you, Mr. Bilal. Thank you.
Can you guys hear me? Yeah? Okay. Thank you all for coming. We are in a session called From Flaubert to Faiz, French and Pakistani Literature. I'm going to introduce the 2 panelists who are with me. Professor David Waterman is a professor at University of France, in France, where he is the director of the Department of Applied Foreign Languages and a member of the research team of Center for Research in International and Atlantic History. David Waterman has authored a book on Pakistani literature recently, Where Worlds Collide, which I encourage you to read because it has essays on all the major Pakistani writers writing in English at the present moment.
Well, they should read it, but they should buy it, especially.
Yeah, buying is more important than reading. Exactly.
Buy it.
Yeah. David Waterman is currently working on Pakistani history, culture and literature in English and has served on the editorial team of Pakistaniyat, which you probably know is an online journal. I'm not sure. It's in some sort of an abeyance at the moment.
It's going through a bad patch at the moment.
Yeah.
Something's wrong. Yeah.
Okay. We're not going to go into that crisis.
No, we're not going to go into that at the moment.
On my extreme right is Dr. Framji Minwalla, who is currently the chair of the Department of Social Sciences and Liberal Arts at the Institute of Business Administration in Karachi. He has taught at numerous institutions including Yale, Vassar, Dartmouth, George Washington University, New York University, Fordham, and Zabast. His research interests include performance literature and history, visual and cultural studies, theatre and politics, media and film, and all forms of theory. His essays and reviews have appeared in Theatre 3, Theatre, American Theatre, Manhattan File, and numerous anthologies. He's currently working on a book tentatively titled Writing Theatre's Histories, an examination of 20th century performance historiography. Dr. Minwalla received...
That's enough.
I'm on the last sentence. Okay, I'm going to push through this. Dr. Minwalla received his BFA from University of Michigan, BA, and MFA and DFA both by the Yale School of Drama. Please welcome them. Welcome. Okay, so as the more perceptive of you must have already gathered, that the connections, the more obvious connections between Pakistani and French literature are tenuous at best. There are few examples of serious Francophiles that you find, that at least I'm aware of, and I've had this discussion with Dr. Waterman and Framji, Minwalla as well, and they agree. I mean, at least it's not in their knowledge. One thinks of somebody like Muhammad Hasan Askari, who was writing in the 30s up until the 60s and 70s. He was a very serious Francophile. He was somebody who was, self-taught French. Okay, I'm just going to acknowledge translations of Iqbal and Faiz. Can you say your name again? Dr. Laik Babra has done the... Babri, sorry. Laik Babri has recently done these translations of Iqbal and Faiz into French as well. Okay.
This is going to be an interesting conversation.
Okay. Thank you for that. So again, I mean, the larger point that I was trying to gesture at is that there are few examples of these Francophiles, some serious Francophiles, and these exchanges between between French and Urdu literatures and Pakistani literatures. One thinks of prominent Urdu short story writers like Manto and Intizar Hussain, and they cite Maupassant as one of their enduring influences. So again, I'm just going to start off by asking Dr. Waterman to present from a little presentation that he's prepared, and then we can move the conversation forward from there on.
Okay, thanks. As Bilal has already suggested, and apparently this is going to work pretty well just from what I've seen coming at us. We wanted this to be a conversation, so I'd prepared just a little something just to give us a starting point and some ideas, and then something to sink our teeth into, and then we can take it wherever we want to go with it, and that could be lots and lots of places. So I've got just a couple of pages just to get us started, if that's okay. And I'm going to make a comparison with Marguerite Yourcenar's Memoirs of Adrian, if you're familiar with that one. In any case, we'll get to it here. So when I was at the Karachi Literature Festival 2 months ago, I'm glad Framji came. He brought a big suitcase, huh? So when I was at the Karachi Literature Festival 2 months ago, I ran into Martine from the cultural service at the French Embassy, and she asked me to come back, in a couple of months, with the idea that we would present some sort of a comparatist approach between, French literature, contemporary Pakistani literature, and English. And I was really excited to return to Pakistan. I'm always excited when somebody says, "Come to Pakistan, we'll pay your way." I say, "Okay, I'll do that." Because you give some talks, you meet new people, you activate your network, and you eat halwa, and you have a great time. But I was a bit worried about that comparative approach that Martine had asked for, since I'm not really a comparative literature person, all right? Confessions number one. Then Martine added she would pay, so I said, okay, I'm not going to let incompetence stand in the way of our talk today. Now, I'm a native English speaker, or at least a native American English speaker, for those of you who are British English snobs. But I've been living and working in France for about 20 years now. And so I'm familiar with some French literature, but not, I've never studied it very, very deeply. And I kind of remain convinced that I'm not a comparatist. So I was fretting about what I could do, short of bluffing and outright lies, to pull off this regard croisé approach between France and Pakistan. And since my invitation came from the French Embassy and from the Alliance Française, it seemed important that I should do so. But as I started digging a bit into the different schools of thought when it comes to comparative literature, I realized I was using an outdated approach to comp lit, right? I was, which is not surprising because I was at university in all of the 1980s and the first half of the 1990s. I was at university for too long. And there were still a fair number of new critics around. And I thought, indeed hoped, that the new critics had all died in 1965 when T.S. Eliot did, but no such luck. Now, the standard version of comparative literature likes to place those literary works in some kind of a continuum, seeking to establish who and what were influences on the work being considered, both within and without different national literatures and languages. And at some point, the nation does remain important in such definitions. Every time I ask Pakistani students whether they consider Pakistani Anglophone fiction to be an integral part of Pakistan's national literature, the answer is always no. The answer is always yes. Now, while this influences approach can lead to some interesting questions like what makes A Season for Martyrs, for example, particularly Pakistani, such nation-based classification and analysis doesn't really take us very far once we've removed historical references from the equation. And of course, the formula is more complicated still if we're considering Anglophone fiction in Pakistan. Now, that might seem a bit odd of a perspective for me to adopt, given that historical fiction is my favorite genre. That's really what I like to read. It's what attracted me to Pakistani fiction in the first place. And while it may be those Pakistani details, large and small, which bring the story to life and engage the reader, at some point, great literature also needs to connect with those big, transnational, even existential questions. And notice I've avoided using the term universal. I'm an amateur astronomer, and I don't believe we're alone out there. Like questions like the meaning of life and death, inequalities and injustices and violence of all sorts, the future of humanity, the role of God in our lives. As I've said elsewhere, this is perhaps the biggest contribution made by Pakistani writers, is to take history with a capital H into account, link it to the everyday, and dare to imagine a Pakistan whose story is not yet finished. And that's how I found my way into a comparative literature approach, by using a more recent, more inclusive definition of complit, placing comparative literature within the context of cultural studies in a much larger sense as a whole, often minimizing national origins in favor of what we've been calling, after Goethe, world literature for a long time now. I did my training in the United States. My undergraduate degree is in psychology, social psychology especially, and my graduate degrees are in English. The dominant schools of thought where I trained were cultural studies and post-colonial theory. I initially got interested in post-colonial theory because part of my family, my mother's side, comes from Ireland, right? And as I was going through my PhD program, I had my professors, certain of my professors told me, you can't do post-colonial theory. You're never going to get a job because you're a white male. Nobody is going to hire a white American to do post-colonial theory. And then one person on my PhD committee stood up, Aparajita Sagar from India, and said, you do whatever you want. And you just tell those other people to go lie down by their dish, and you'll be fine. And I was. And what is post-colonial theory, after all, if not a framework or a toolbox which helps us to better understand globalization, especially global capitalism, with the colonial project as a step along the way? I do know theorists who say we shouldn't even talk about post-colonialism. It's just one step along the way of global capitalism, in fact. And when I was doing my training, it was in the English department that we read Goethe and de Beauvoir, Cervantes and Dostoevsky, even Freud and Marx. We even read those guys in the English department, all under the rubric of world literature. And so today, what we've come here to do, we'll see if we succeed or not, is to not to remove Pakistani Anglophone literature from Pakistan's national cultural consciousness, but to suggest that Pakistani literature is indeed world literature as well. One doesn't exclude the other, after all. So I don't, or we don't intend to answer the question, what makes this literature Pakistani or French or anything else, but instead argue from the other side of the fence, what makes this Pakistani literature and this French literature world literature. So we'll see what you have to say. Now we can go further afield if you like, but the touchstone that I decided to use was Marguerite Yourcenau's 1951 novel, Mémoires Memoirs of Adrian as a touchstone from the French world literature side of the fence. Now, I'm assuming nobody's read it. Who's read it? Yeah, Marguerite Yourcenar. Yes? No, okay, so I'll give you the 3-line. One person? No. A little. Okay. You read it on what? Wikipedia or?
I just went through it. So
Okay. So a little 3-line summary is in order, maybe? Yeah, in fact, that wasn't her name. It was a pen name, right? Marguerite Yourcenar, of course, she was born in 1903 of mixed heritage, Belgian-French parentage. And her masterwork was a long time in coming. She started it in 1924, abandoned it, burned her manuscripts, restarted in 1934, re-abandoned, re-burned her manuscripts, and then restarted in 1948, and including what she called the lapse into despair of a writer who does not write. She finally published the novel in French in 1951. Now, if you can read French, you should always read it in the original language, but if you can't, that's okay, because the English translation by Grace Frick, her longtime, life companion, is excellent. And even if you're not terribly interested in French literature, it doesn't matter. This is world literature. It's one of the best things that's ever been written anywhere in any language. And I recommend it on that basis. She died in 1988. She was the first woman ever elected to the Académie Française in 1980. Okay? And now, the kinds of things that I identified, the Memoirs of Adrian, it's the Emperor Adrian, right? In years, I forget the exact years, from 117 to 138. And he's looking back on his life, about what it's like to be an emperor. He's writing his memoir for his successor, Marcus Aurelius. And I noticed lots and lots of different themes that came up that we could connect with contemporary Pakistani fiction, right? She's going back in time, which is the first thing that caught my eye, because a lot of contemporary Pakistani fiction goes back in time. Let me just find where I'm at here. I'm either a big fan of... I've lost my place. I do this a lot, you see. Well, he goes back in time for his memoirs, right? In the way that oftentimes the Pakistani fiction writers do. Sometimes they go a little bit back in time. They go back to before Zia, for example. Or they go back to a time before partition. Or if you've read The Reluctant Fundamentalists or Geometry of God, you know that we go back to a pre-Islamic time, right, in the history of Pakistan. So that was the first sort of technique that caught my eye. And then all of these other kinds of things come up in this novel of empire, right, these memoirs of empire. Things like good government, the uses and abuses of power, subaltern agency, social equality, education, the situation of women and children, including their right to inherit. These all come up in Yourcenar's novel. The army and Praetorian society, religion, science, concerns regarding the future of the empire, reflections on death. So, citing Paul Bailey's introduction to the Penguin edition, quote, Yourcenar's Adrian becomes strong through doubt, through his keen appreciation that truth is often partial, through his ability for self-examination. Everything is seen through Adrian's generally unclouded eyes. In other words, the critically minded, clear-sighted perspective exemplified by Amal's grandfather, for example, the paleontologist in The Geometry of God, as he teaches his granddaughter to see. And that I just put together as a sort of a starting point. But those kinds of thematic connections are interesting, but not that interesting, right? Because what makes those connections typically French? Well, we could do the same kind of thing with German literature or other kinds of literatures. So then what we need to do is take that the next step and ask that question, okay, so what? What are we going to do with those? So what? Framji.
So what? You know, one of the things I've been thinking about in relation to, and when thinking about literatures in comparative context, is actually to think about it in the context of sort of historical periodization, and in a sense, what is happening in the context of any particular nation in which a national literatures are produced in relation to the particular sort of events, specifically crises or challenges that give birth to a kind of literature, maybe not at the moment of crisis or challenge, but perhaps a few decades after. So if you think about French literature, not necessarily in the 20th century, but certainly in the 19th century, the emergence of the realist novel, well, even going back to the romantic novel and Victor Hugo, which gives rise to authors like Émile Zola and Balzac, that the rise of the realist novel is very much tied to a set of social movements that are emerging in Europe and specifically in France, tied to issues related to the French Revolution going back to the late part of the 18th century, tied to the events of May 1848, to the Paris Commune somewhat later than that, and that the literatures actually attempt to make sense out of a kind of national history. And I think part of what David is trying to get at in relation to the memoirs of Hadrian is that in some ways this is also, I mean, put into a kind of larger European context, the notion of empire, which is very much part of the French consciousness, especially at the moment where decolonization begins, and you know, the scars of Algeria, which certainly have not yet healed, just like the scars of Bangladesh, which have not healed for us. That, you know, we can think about colonization and colonialism both from the perspective of being colonized and also functioning as, in some ways, colonizers in relation to the eastern part of this country, which is no longer part of this country. So my sense is that, you know, one of the things that happens in the 19th century is that the realist novel as a force, a cultural force and a literary force in France, emerges in a similar way to the way in which the realist novel has emerged beginning in the sort of 70s and, well, even earlier than that, in the 60s, 70s and 80s in Pakistan. Beginning with, you know, writers like perhaps Zulfikar Ghose, or then Babsi Sidhwa, Hanif Qureshi, who doesn't really consider himself a Pakistani writer, but Rushdie and Rushdie's novel Shame, certainly Midnight's Children, of course, and then, you know, but you know, if you think about writers in the subcontinent or in South Asia beyond just simply the context of Pakistan, you also think of writers like Anita Desai, who has written one of the most beautiful novels about partition I think ever written, A Clear Light of Day. If you haven't read that, you really should. So I think, you know, part of the way in which one can look at in terms of periodization is how a particular literature or a particular aesthetic form in literary discourse emerges at a particular historical moment. And I think that for Pakistan at least, we have not reached yet, perhaps in poetry but not necessarily in the novel, the kind of experimentation that begins in France in the early part of the 20th century with symbolist and surrealist movements, and with changes in extending the form of the novel or extending the form of fiction with writers like who am I thinking of?
French side or the Pakistani side?
French side. Mauriac, for example, with a novel like Thérèse d'Esquerot, or, you know, these are things that, you know, I have not actually read much recent French literature. I've read much some 19th century and 20th century.
Are we going to admit what we talked about before we came here?
That we know nothing about the recent Nobel Prize laureate?
Yeah, neither of us has read the recent Nobel laureate.
We have never read them.
We've read the older stuff, but not the more recent stuff.
But I think, you know, part of what Pakistani literature is going through is that it emerges as a kind of realist form, and that the realist form mirrors in some ways the realist form that emerges, or the realist novel that emerges in France in the 19th century, in order to, in a sense, excavate history or excavate historical events, come to terms with historical events in fictional form, understand them in fictional form, try to understand or try to get at the sort of everyday effects of larger sort of national events, everyday effects on ordinary people, which is very much what recent Pakistani fiction has attempted to do, you either in satirical form, like Case of the Exploding Mangoes, or in more serious. If you haven't seen or read Sonia Kamal's new novel, her first novel, new novel, An Isolated Incident, which is about trauma in Kashmir, and really one of the more sort of beautifully considered novels about the effects of trauma on a woman who is then dislocated from her homeland in multiple ways. So, I think that if we think about it, not necessarily just in terms, I mean, yes, of course, with thematic connections or thematic relationships, but also in relation to sort of national histories and the ways in which national histories proceed, and how national histories themselves demand a kind of fictional, or not necessarily fictional, but imaginative confrontation. So that the novel really, not just in English but also in Urdu, certainly Manto's stories, but on the other side of the border, Ismet Chughtai stories, have Kurutal and Heather stories, Ismet Chughtai's sort of muse and mentor, whose name is now escaping me, Rashid Jahan, Rashida Jahan. Right, thank you. Yes. So the work, I think, if you think about it in those contexts, I think that may be one of the productive ways in which we can bring together the relationships between writers and their nations, and the specific grounded, concrete histories in which they're writing,
right,
and about which they're writing.
And the way that these writers that we're talking about do that with historical fiction, it allows them to get away from the purely historical mode, because they don't have that necessary obligation to truth, whatever that is, the facts, and they can do more things with that. They can become political, but in subtle ways, so that it's not propaganda, as you were saying in an earlier panel. And what can you do if you're writing historical fiction that the historian can't do? Well, you can do things like you can foreground those minor characters that the historical record has forgotten, because the historical record is usually about great men, right, and battles and things. And you can talk about other people. You can talk about those minor characters, or you can even invent some characters in there if you like to. Or you can psychologize those historical figures, which is what Yourcenar does with Adrian, right? You can go into their heads and say this is what they were thinking and what they were trying to accomplish.
Interject and pose a question, actually.
He's the moderator, so we have to let him do that from time to time.
But I think that it's an interesting point that you raise, Framji, that at the beginning, when we saw the emergence of the realist novel in France, right? So we have Balzac, we have Zola, we have, and again, this inspired a whole bunch of other people. And you're trying to draw a parallel with Pakistan at this moment, but I think that there's a problem, because I think that methodologically speaking, it tends to think of history as a kind of a teleology, right?
Yes.
You're saying that
yes.
Europe started there and it got to this point and finally came to experiment after whatever 100 years. And we are just starting out with the realist novel, and one day we are going to get there and start experimenting as well. But I think that I just want to problematize that and say that that's perhaps really not the case, and perhaps that's not how things progress, right? Again, and especially in literature, right? And again, I mean, if you see so many of the works coming out of South Asia at large, because Pakistan is a particularly small sample, they are experimental, they are doing interesting things formally, aesthetically. So again, but I think one of the things that is particularly interesting about fiction that's coming out from this part of the world, which is what David pointed out earlier, is that it takes history seriously. It talks about history with a capital H, and again, that's where I think productive conversation can be had, whether that history can be engaged with using conventional realist modes, or do you need perhaps experimental writing in order to make sense of the kind of fragmentary reality that people inhabit at this present moment.
I mean, I think that actually the Pakistani novel, if we can talk about the Pakistani novel as a kind of monolithic thing, which I don't think we can. But firstly, I think you're exactly right. And I have this tendency in my thinking and in my critical work to think of history teleologically, and it's a bad thing to do. I agree with you. And sometimes I also find it useful to think about sort of transformations that happen historically. I mean, David writes about literature. I don't really write about literature. I write about drama. And certainly if you look at theater as a form, right? And if you even look at French theater as a form, for example, there is considerable aesthetic experimentation happening in France in the drama as early as perhaps the 19th century, 18th century, 19th century. I mean, if you look at writers like sort of earlier writers like Marivaux, there is already incredible experimentation in theatrical form that's happening with writers like Marivaux. Even political writers, or really like de Musset in the drama, is this fantastic play called L'Enzacchio, which if you have not read, earlier than that, by the time in the sort of the neoclassical era, writers like Molière, who is constantly experimenting with theatrical form and pushing aesthetic form forward in really the writers we read today in any sort of literary tradition, whether in theatrical, poetic, or fictional, prose fiction, are those writers that have in some ways made advances both in terms of subject matter address, but also in terms of the aesthetic form that the extending the limits of the forms within which they have been writing. So one of the reasons that if you try and read Zola's fiction today, I'm sure that most of you will fall asleep before the page 30. It can be incredibly tedious to read. But when Zola was writing, nobody else was writing like this. Nobody else was actually doing the kinds of things in the novel, in the form of the novel, and even in the form of the play. I mean, he adapted many of his plays and many of his novels into plays, for example. And the notion of real time that was structured into his fictional form and into his theatrical form, so you actually had to wait for characters to go off stage, go to the bathroom, and then come back, right? Which in theater is actually incredibly deadly, because if you're waiting for somebody to go off stage, do whatever they have to do in the bathroom and come back, that's dead time in the theater, right? Audiences are staring at an empty stage, like but it was radical in terms of actually thinking through what is possible on the stage. And even though some of these were spectacular failures, they were useful failures. So the point I'm trying to make is that in terms of Pakistani fiction, the point I was trying to make is that while that I have not read yet or seen yet people really pushing hard against the boundaries. I think one of the novels that does that is yours, actually. The Scatter here is too great. I think one of the recent novels that does that, that pushes against the boundaries of a particular sort of literary form, is Shandana Minhas's children's novel, Survival Tips for Lunatics. I think the more sort of celebrated writers that we have, and they are incredibly accomplished writers. I'm not saying anything about the quality of their writing, but I don't think that they are necessarily pushing against the boundaries of aesthetic form. And that's what I was trying to get at. So writers like Nadeem Aslam, Kamla Shamsi.
I'm just going to query you on that, actually. David, you want to say anything to that?
I'm okay in the middle, just going back and forth there.
I think that part of it perhaps has to do with the question of the reception of art, how that work is received, and what sort of an audience that you're conversing with, right? So one of the things that people have said about my novel is that it's not a novel. It's because people are not used to reading anything that is formally challenging, that is asking them to do work that they are not attuned to doing while reading novels. So, but my novel has been translated into French, and it has received most positive reviews over there, simply because they understand the form, they understand it formally, that it is a novel constructed in smaller fragments, that you perhaps sometimes have to work hard to find those connections where those connections may lie. So again, I mean, part of that is perhaps has to do with the constraint that number of Pakistani writers are working with, that they are faced with the audience. And again, let's not forget the thrust of the world market as well, right? I mean, the publishers want you to write a kind of a straight realist novel with a kind of a story that is easily adapted to Hollywood then.
Right. And
Right?
if we're going to stick with our thesis that Pakistani fiction is world literature, there are certain constraints, maybe formal constraints as well, that go along with that classification, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yes, I think that's part of the issue, but that shouldn't actually stop writers from really sort of tackling these issues, tackling the issues. And I'm not saying that any particular or individual writer should suddenly become an experimental novelist, right? I'm not saying that Kamla should abandon what she does, or Nadeem Aslam should abandon what he does. I mean, they do what they do, and they do it extremely well. I think one of the writers who has actually begun to test the limits of the form of the novel is Uzma Aslam Khan. If you've read her recent novel, Thinner Than Skin actually works on multiple levels, using multiple voices to tell a very particular story, both in the third person and the first person, using a completely unlikable, unreliable first-person narrator who actually gives you the bulk of the narrative that we experience in that novel. Geometry of God is another one, is the novel in which she experiments actually considerably. So it's not that it's not happening, but I think that that it's not happening. It's not happening sort of deliberately enough yet. And I think that one of the things that actually pushed French literature past in the 19th and the early part of the 20th century onto the world stage was the ways in which actually French writers truly pushed the form of the novel. I mean, writers like Marguerite Duras, writers like Nathalie Sarraute, Yourcenar, François Mauriac, that they took the 19th century realist novel and they tore it apart. They literally just fundamentally tore it apart as a form, and part of it, I think, emerges out of a series of historical events that happened in the 20th century. So,
I think that's really what I want to get at, because I think that, again, looking at form, as something that as an end in itself is problematic, right? I mean, the formal constraints that writers are working with are constraints of a particular period of time. There are constraints including that of the audience, right? What will be legible to your audience, right? And I think that is really, because again, I mean, studying technique or studying form as an end in itself, I don't think any great work of art was constructed purely as an act of technique, right? Yeah. They are constructed to solve problems of content itself. So the content that you're working with perhaps is so fragmentary that you cannot deal with it in a conventional realist novel, right? So then you try to come up with different ways to try to account for that material, right? And that's where the experimentation comes in. That's where other things come in, and when people start telling you they don't understand anything that you write.
David, we should let David speak.
David,
I'm sorry, there was a question? Or?
Provoking the reader. I mean, if you read
we'll just come to that.
thought-provoking-
We'll just, can you hold on to that thought? Can you just hold on to that? We're just going to take that question once we come to the...
And the question is?
The question is about form and history and thinking about aesthetics. No.
I don't know anything about aesthetics.
I mean, I think, yes, you do.
When we get to talking about art, you see, I never know anything about aesthetics because I'm too thick to understand, truth and beauty and things like that.
No, but I think you're being disingenuous a little bit, David, because reading your book, this one.
Oh, yeah. See, we planned this. We're plugging each other's work here today.
Right. I mean, one of the really lovely things in your book is that you actually link the specific subject matter, what Bilal is talking about, of these novels that you write about, Noor, Mangoes, right? And you link them to a particular history and a concrete
particular
history.
historical event, right?
And you talk about the way in which the authors themselves actually structure narratives to make sense out of that history.
And those are often intersections with the formal approach that they use with history, and also with what we could call traumatic experience as well. So there's this kind of individual and social psychological problem that has to be solved in one way or another too. In a certain historical context, what you can say and who can say it in certain places and certain times. And how these writers attack that sort of formula, I suppose, or equation.
Yeah.
David, you want to talk a little bit about how Pakistani writing is received in France at the moment?
Okay. Well, as you know, that I'm an English teacher, and in spite of my efforts, France remains a French-speaking country. Some of the writers have been translated into French. Kamala Shamsi's the most recent one that I attended, the book launch for French, was Burnt Shadows. Came out in French about a year ago now, or a year and a half. And so these writers are being translated into French. So there is a market for the French readers for this kind of fiction. So obviously there's something there that connects with a French readership. Which is kind of fun. Well, it's not really funny for France is not an Anglophone country, all right? It's not the US, it's not the UK. Almost everybody who's properly educated in France can read English, and they can usually speak English well enough to communicate, right? Even if they're not perfect in it. And yet when they're choosing reading for pleasure, if you will, whatever that means, reading for pleasure, they generally choose to do so in their native language, which I suppose is normal. When I do that, I choose to read in English for the most part. I only read in French when there's no other choice. And so the reception for the moment is less than it has been in the Anglophone countries, but it's coming. We're just a little bit behind the curve. And they're getting great reviews, and so I think we're just a little bit behind, but that's a language issue, and we're getting there.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, can I just add one thing actually?
Yeah,
so one of the Pakistani writers who is, I think, actually very influenced by French writing, contemporary writers, is Amir Hussain. So if you actually read Amir's work and Amir's short stories, and Amir himself says this, that and Amir speaks, I don't know, 50,000 languages and translates from many languages into other languages, into French as well. And if you read his short stories, I mean, they seem almost like symbolist poems or surrealist poems, with the kind of sort of craft and polish, like, almost like, marble sculptures themselves. But the words themselves are, the words he uses are specific, concrete, precise, and really polished. And I think Amir is one of those writers, contemporary writers, who has both embraced a tradition and also pushed that tradition forward, but a tradition that is both in some ways Pakistani and at the same time also very French. And so there's a coming together of two different kinds of thinking about writing in his work. So if you haven't read Amir's work, I mean, his most recent collection called The Swan's Wife is a really lovely, lovely collection to read.
Excellent. Can we open it up for questions? Okay. Can we start? But before, okay, start.
On? Yeah, I'm Asma Mansoor from the Islamic University. I'm Asma Mansoor from the Islamic University.
Can you hold the mic a little closer?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do I need to introduce
That's
myself
better.
again? Yes. I'm Asma from the Islamic University. First of all, I have a question for the whole panel. You've talked about history and and the way fiction, Pakistani fiction or French fiction brings sort of is connected on the historical plane. But the element that is missing in this entire discussion is the impact of French philosophy specifically in the interpretation of Pakistani literature. Because my thesis, when I did my MPhil, it incorporated the Foucauldian notions of power in the interpretation of identity as presented in post 9/11 Pakistani fiction in English. So we need to talk about how philosophy, French philosophy specifically, is influencing Pakistani literature in English. And I have a complaint for yeah. You said that you like to come to Pakistan whenever somebody is willing to pay for it.
Yeah.
But when you invited me to La Rochelle, you never volunteered to pay for my journey and travel expenses.
I would have loved to. One of the first things you learn when you work in the French university systems is they tell you, you can do anything you want, but we're not giving you any money to do it. Yes. Well, you're absolutely right. French philosophy, and the other thing that's missed that we kind of left out, but we had talked about between us earlier too, was politics as well. We could talk about the whole political program, and how so many of these progressive and communist writers on both sides were kind of cross-fertilizing as well. But in terms of French philosophy, yes, exactly. And we could one of the collaborative projects that we're working on at the moment with Fauzia from Islamia, Fauzia Janjua, has to do with feminist influence in Pakistani. Contemporary Pakistani fiction, what it has to say about the situation of women. And if we're going to do that, we need to talk about the French feminists. We just we can't get away with that. Yeah. And so you're absolutely right that that element could be included as well.
Okay.
Oh, and sometimes when I come to Pakistan, I pay myself too. I usually end up paying the plane ticket myself, and they put me up.
I am Sarwar Naqvi, and I am a retired government servant. One or two observations. You see, French literature has had the biggest impact on Urdu and Pakistani literature compared to other European languages. I mean, you don't have the impact of Italian literature or German literature, or the next big one is perhaps Russian, but the French literature has had a very powerful influence over our writers, poets, everybody. Now, most of what you have said is very good and interesting, but I noticed the absence. Well, I can say that because I am much older than all of you. But the gap that I noticed was the absence of modern French literature. I mean, you have not talked of Jean-Paul Sartre, you have not talked about Simone de Beauvoir, you have not talked about Albert Camus. And Camus was extremely influential on most Pakistani writers of the 50s and the 60s. Sadiq Khan did the first cover of L'Étranger in France, and that was anyway. And in Pakistan, Dr. Laik Babri translated Faiz into French. He wrote a book called From Baudelaire to Ghalib, and he's a great scholar. He was a great scholar. He passed away. He taught at Quaid-e-Azam University. So, I just wanted to make a few observations.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for
And
that.
just one thought comes to mind when you talk about the influence of French literature on Pakistani arts and letters. Sometimes I wonder if there isn't that historical articulation there as well, because as a former British colony, of course, the educated middle and upper classes in Britain, for the most part, studied French as well. And so I'm wondering if part of the colonial inheritance in Pakistan wasn't to continue that tradition, that habit, where many of the I think it's probably less today, or am I wrong? But at least in the early years after partition and independence, when many more of the educated elite, middle and upper classes in Pakistan learn French as well, or am I wrong?
But you know, I think this is actually also a European issue, because I think that, you know, especially in Russia in the 19th century, right? If you were sophisticated, you spoke French, and you read French, and you read French literature. In England, at the same time, if you were sophisticated, you read, not perhaps in Germany, though perhaps to a certain extent even in Germany, but not necessarily as much as in those two countries. Spain developed its own tradition, Italy developed its own tradition, I think separate from and distinct from, and I think partly Germany and Italy, because they had recently been reunified in the 19th century, had not really developed. I mean, while they had writers and you know, significant and beautiful writers, that they were not necessarily considered national writers at the time. I mean, Goethe is considered a national German writer after the fact, not really necessarily while he was writing, and not while the Weimar movement was flourishing. I think your point about the French philosophy is, I mean, certainly the progressive writers were hugely influenced by Camus and Sartre, and really Marx filtered through them, right? So part of their learning was about the way in which Marx was re-articulated in those French writers, and then filtered into their own work, or then was represented in their own work. So you're absolutely right. It's a huge lacune in what we were discussing. But you know, I also think that in some ways, as writers of literature, right, people like Camus and Sartre were not nearly as good as some of the other writers that were as writers of literature emerging. They were certainly brilliant writers of philosophy, and L'Étranger is, you know, one of the seminal works in French literature. I mean, I had to read it when I was in school, and everybody memorized the first two lines, right? Aujourd'hui, maman est morte, ou peut-être hier, je ne sais pas. But you know, I don't think that their writing necessarily influenced Pakistani writers in terms of fiction writing or poetry. I think their philosophical thinking did, yes. So.
Okay, there's a question here, and then we can go there.
See, that's the hard part when you're the moderator, choosing who to call
I can do
right?
it. It's not a problem.
Hello, I'm Farhana from the Islamic University. Actually, I wanted to ask about this very idea of comparison and comparative literatures, because there is always an idea behind that why actually are we comparing to literatures? Is it the comparison of language, or comparison of cultures, or comparison of philosophy, or whatever? Susan Besant, in her book, Comparative Literatures, she actually traces how comparative literatures actually started as a discipline in the European university. Later on, the third world countries, and especially the colonized countries, actually used it to assert their identities. They compared their literature with the Western to assert their identities. Now, this recent comparison you're talking about now, because you mentioned both these, right? That we can trace the form in them and now, because in the earlier power, when the comparative literature started in the Western countries, they actually used it to assert their superiority, right? That actually we were using this form back then, and these countries are using it now. So yeah, my question is that what end actually we're trying to get at? I mean, why are we comparing, or what do you think we should compare
the question,
French and the
right?
Pakistani literature?
Yeah, that's the so what that we started off with, and that we've been debating.
I have one quite literal answer to that. It's because David was here and Martine asked him, and we decided to do the panel and see where we got. Really, I mean, part of these conversations is about seeing where we get to, I think, by the end of the conversation. And
and I think that, you know, the idea, again, you know, none of us are experts in the area. So, I mean, these kinds of contributions that Naqvi Saab made are really the point of it, right? So that we can all learn from each other, being in each other's presence. Okay, there's the lady over here. She's been really dying to say something. Hello, Mike.
If I was audible enough before.
Yeah, scientific literature, can we consider that?
Louis Pasteur, I mean, we tend to quote him a whole lot. Does he come into the equation? And then the question is, was the Pope ever French in terms of religious literature, maybe religious French influence? Because these writers are, I think, socialists and political, maybe,
right?
Who influenced thought and philosophy. more than the scientific contributions, scientific literature that a lot of people in Asia and Pakistan are
Okay,
influenced
there
by.
was another question over there. Do you still want to ask it? Yeah, that gentleman over there.
Hello, I'm Abraham Murad. I'm a researcher at FC College and at ITU in Lahore. I must commend this session. It's been really informative for someone who is not really into literature that much. I am of course familiar with the works of Beauvoir, Camus, and all of that. But since you mentioned that you write about plays and that David writes about literature in general, could you suggest some good books, for a startup in maybe French literature and Pakistani literature, apart from Kamila Shamsi, Manto, and all of that?
So
Okay,
criticism or actual
Books.
text? Okay, all right.
Oh, where to start?
Scientific literature first.
Oh yeah, scientific literature first. What do I know about scientific literature? I don't know anything about scientific. Do you know anything about Bilal? Do you know anything about scientific literature?
I mean, I can barely spell it.
Usually, when you're in this kind of situation, there are two choices. You can either try and bluff, or you can say, "I have no idea."
Well, I mean, I think we can say I have no idea, and actually go back a little further. So if you look at what happens in the 1700s, 1700s encyclopedia, yes. That the sort of the writing, or but the compilation of Diderot's great encyclopedia, when was it? 18th century, right? Yeah. I'm trying to say 1740s, 1750s, around then. And the compilation, and I think that was a sort of certainly a European event, not just a French event, but eventually a global event, because the compilation of that encyclopedia at the in the heart of the Enlightenment, the emergence of scientific thought, and the sort of classification of thought into categories that included scientific thinking and scientific writing, was hugely important for literatures across the world, not just in France. So I mean, that much I can say without really knowing much about Pasteur's scientific writing itself, and I think that had an influence on everybody. I mean, that without question had an influence.
Okay, we're kind of running. You can answer. We have run out of time.
Just very quickly, I was going to say the further back we go in time, the less science and literature and history and art are all separated. That's where that PhD degree comes from. All right, because scientists used to be called natural philosophers, and as you go further back in time, those great mathematicians, they were also poets and biologists and
magicians.
They didn't fall into those categories that we were talking about. And even when you read the current Pakistani writers, like Geometry of God, there's that scene in there about Pascal's flea, right? Remember? I'm not mixing up my books, am I? Is that one? Yeah. Where there's see the universe in a flea, right? And his mind would never rest again because of the influence of not only science but philosophy and all the rest. I'm sorry.
Okay, 2 books each that you can recommend to the gentleman over there.
2 books each?
Yes.
For literature? I tell people that they should start with Noor for literature. What's your recommendation for?
For French literature?
Yeah.
Both French and English.
Oh,
I mean, both
French
and Pakistani. In terms of plays, you should read Molière, you should read Racine, you should read de Musset. I don't know, poets, you should read, my favorite poets, Apollinaire, Rimbaud, Baudelaire. Yes, Céline for the novel, Mauriac for the modernist novel. I don't know. The list is just endless.
And your Sanar, huh? And then for plays too, the guy who's not French, he's Romanian but wrote in French, right? Who wrote Rhinoceros?
UNESCO.
UNESCO. I visit him every time I'm in Paris. We have lunch together. He's been dead for 20 years, but there's a bench right next to his grave. So.
Talking about Irish writers, Samuel Beckett.
Yes, well, he's not far from UNESCO. I chat with him sometimes too.
Why not Baudelaire and
Yes.
Uzma Aslam Khan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Pakistani writers, Manto, of course. Uzma Aslam Khan, who you may not have heard of or read, she's a lovely writer. Shandana Minhas is Suraya Khan.
Yep.
I mean, really, just go out to Liberty Books outside and just, look at all the fiction and pick the stuff that interests you and read it. Sorry.
Okay, man, we've started to break things. Thank you so much for coming. It's been a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for attending this session. The next session will start at 2:30 and we hope to see you again. Thank you.